free for everyone. Wonderful lecture from the Library of Congress. Her name is Carolyn Brown, and she's head of their scholarly programs. But she has a very unusual talk. It's going to be on libraries and the moral life. And it's a subject she's given a lot of thought to, and I highly recommend it. And she's going to be in the Heritage Room of the library. There's been a change of venue in case you are going to come. It's 5:30, and there's a reception following it, so try to make it. But today I'm welcoming you to our third World Affairs Luncheon seminar of the semester. It's always an anticipatory pleasure to welcome back Stephen Kinzer to the Schemmel Forum. His fertile mind and his vast experience, not to mention his extraordinary communication skills, make him a one-man world affairs institution. I don't know that we could persuade him to spend more time with us, but I think we can. I assure you we'd be a lot wiser if and when he comes back. Stephen first came to the attention of the University of Scranton when his book, A Thousand Hills, Rwanda's Rebirth and the Man Who Dreamed It, was selected as a freshman read. He has spoken to the Schemmel Forum on his book, Reset, Iran, Turkey, and America's Future. The Huffington Post referred to him on the occasion of its publication as a journalist of a certain cheeky fearlessness and exquisite timing. I love that. Looking backward and then forward, he was with the New York Times for 20 years, posted in the Middle East, Nicaragua, Germany, and Turkey, always on the firing line. Before joining the New York Times, Stephen was a Latin American correspondent for the Boston Globe. Looking ahead, his soon-to-be-published book is called Brothers, John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, and Their Secret World War. That isn't provocative. So I'm sure that we'll see him again in the fall when that book comes out. Right now, please help me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thanks so much for having me back here. This is a wonderful institution, this series of lectures. It's great to be back on this campus, for which I feel a special affection, and I admire what Sandra and other organizers have done to bring the world here, which is one of the purposes of any university anywhere. And the world today is a difficult place to fit into any university campus. We're facing some new and difficult challenges in the world. I think we are entering into an era that's going to be unfamiliar to most of us. The arc of American history has been short, but I think in a certain way misleading. Our short history has led us to believe something that nations that have existed for a long time don't believe, which is that everything always gets better and we're always on top. If you've been around like China or Iran over many, many centuries, you know that things go up and things go down. And when your country's on a downslide, it's not a reason to panic. It just means you got to wait it out, and pretty soon you'll be on an upslide, if a century from now constitutes pretty soon. We're not used to thinking that way. History shows that times when geopolitical relationships are unstable, when certain countries are growing in power, others are losing power, are moments of danger in the world. They're moments of instability. You can go all the way back to the Peloponnesian War, where according to my Thucydides, hostilities began when Sparta, which was the dominant power, feared that Athens was building up its armory, so they decided we should attack them first before they get strong enough to attack us. And you can trace this pattern all the way through history up to as recently as World War I, when the British were very worried that Germany was building a big naval fleet that might one day challenge British power. That was one of the reasons why Britain was ready to get involved with that war. We are now at such a moment of changing geopolitical relationships in the world. I truly believe that the rise of China is going to present the United States with its most difficult foreign policy challenge ever. We are going to have to deal with a rising power, a power that in history has a heritage of authority and hegemonic influence in a large region, a country that is not our enemy, God forbid it ever should become our enemy. Nonetheless, it has ambitions which would conflict with ours if we don't redefine ours. This is a highly complex challenge, but we're not really able to focus on it because so much of our diplomatic energy is being sucked into the Middle East. The Middle East has become something like a black hole from which no geopolitical originality can emerge because everything gets pulled into there. Despite President Obama's efforts to make what he calls this pivot towards focusing America on the region of East Asia and the Pacific, the fact is most of the upheaval that is obsessing us now is coming out of the Middle East and surrounding regions. We are still subject in that region to some traditional American impulses. One of those impulses, always very strong in our history, is the impulse to intervene. It's a product of old ideas of American exceptionalism and manifest destiny. In some ways, it's very well motivated. I believe that Americans are an exceptionally compassionate people. We truly hate the idea that anybody is suffering anywhere. I still remember when I was working for the New York Times, writing an article that appeared on the front page of the paper from Nicaragua during the Contra War there. I went to the room in the hospital where children were being treated. And it was a horrific scene because there were no pain-killing drugs and the children were screaming and moaning. And I conveyed all this in what we call a tearjerker. And quite a pathetic story with a picture on the front of a kid who had had his limbs blown off by a Contra mine. People started sending me $100 bills in envelopes from America and saying, please bring this money to Jose's doctor so Jose can have some toys and some pain-killing drugs. It really showed me how Americans truly want to help those who are suffering. What it means is that our leaders have also noticed this. They notice how compassionate our people are. And anytime they want to intervene anywhere for whatever reason, they now know that if they cloak their decision to intervene in the mantle of human rights and helping the downtrodden, Americans will be quick to support the intervention. This can be very dangerous. When you violently intervene in the politics of another country, you're doing something like releasing a wheel at the top of a hill. You can let it go, but you have no idea of how it's going to bounce or where it's ultimately going to end up. In fact, the history of our interventions, including our more recent ones, shows that they always have unpredictable consequences. Looking at the Middle East, just to cite one obvious example, in 1953, the United States decided that it couldn't tolerate the democratic government of Iran because the Iranian parliament had decided to nationalize its oil. Therefore, along with the British, we launched an operation to overthrow that democratic regime. We reimposed the Shah. The Shah ruled with increasing repression for 25 years until he was overthrown by a regime of fanatic clerics who imposed a deeply anti-American regime, which has spent the last 35 years working very hard, in some cases very violently, to undermine American influence all over the world. I can hardly wrap my mind around how different the Middle East might look if we had managed to be patient and perhaps found ourselves with a thriving democracy in the heart of the Muslim Middle East all these last 50 years. Military intervention in the affairs of other countries always has bad results. There are some times when the result of not intervening would be even worse than the result of intervening. On those occasions, intervention may be justified. But I hold that those are rare. Those are the exceptions to the rule. Sometimes we are unable to spin out what might be the long-term consequences of our interventions. And I can understand that because some of them are quite difficult to foresee. What I would like to see, however, is that in planning these interventions or considering them, we realize that there are going to be consequences that nobody in the room has thought of yet. That always happens. And I want to give you one example of something that's going on in the world right now as we speak that is lightly covered now, but I think is the beginning of what's going to be an important world crisis in the years ahead. And it's what's happening in a country that most people have never heard of. I always like those kind of countries because it means nothing really bad is happening there. That's why no foreign correspondents ever go to Norway. We only go where people are suffering. It's terrible. In fact, it reminds me of a time when I was in Nicaragua and the candidate running against the Sandinistas was having his first press conference, and the Sandinista reporters were shouting at him, and they were telling him, "You have no program for Nicaragua. You don't know what you want to do. You're just against the Sandinistas. You're just bringing the American agenda here." And he was a very humble gentleman, and he was quite taken aback by this assault. I think he might have physically taken a couple of steps backwards. And finally, he had an idea. And he came back to the microphone, and he pointed to all of us foreign correspondents. And he said, "You know, I do have an idea for Nicaragua. I have a great goal for Nicaragua." And he pointed to all the foreign correspondents. And there were a huge number of us in Nicaragua at that time. He said, "I want to create a country that is so calm and stable and boring that none of you will ever come back here." Now that might have been a description of the country I'm about to speak about, and that's Mali. You know about Mali in North Africa, great musical tradition, former trading empire in past centuries, home of that city that's kind of the epitome of thinking far away from nowhere, Timbuktu. So Mali has been living in relative stability since it became independent in 1960, but now it's undergoing terrible upheaval. The entire northern region of Mali, which is an area the size of Texas, very few people, vast expanses, has been taken over by a radical jihadist coalition under the wing of what's called AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. We already have reports of people having their hands chopped off, of couples being stoned to death, of women being forbidden to leave their homes, and men being required to wear beards. You are seeing an extreme form of Islamic Salafism, that brand of Islam that is rooted in Saudi Arabia, spreading through very violent actions in northern Mali. This is going to become a very serious crisis for us. It's going to be a gestating area for terrorism. And it, mark my words, will be the next front in our drone war, because how else will we find everybody there that we want to kill? We are now engaged in an intensifying effort to try to figure out how to deal with this spreading problem in the heart of North Africa. Now, there's been a little bit of news coverage of these episodes. Sometimes when you hear one story about, for example, the couple that was buried up to their waist and stoned to death, that makes a little blurb in the news. But it's very frustrating to me to read these stories. And I can now make a confession that I wasn't able to make during 30 years I worked as a newsman. I can now admit I'm not interested in news. I don't like news. I feel that news is too often a distraction from what's really important, because news is what's happening right now. What I'm more interested in is two other things, actually. Not what's happening today. I'd like to know, first of all, what happened yesterday? How did we get here? Why is what's now happening? And the other thing I'm interested in is, what's going to happen tomorrow? What is the impact? What is the meaning of what happened today? I feel when news media outlets are so caught up in the breaking news cycle, that sucks up all their energy, and there's no space left for more reflective reporting about the news. So when I read these stories about Mali, I'm frustrated because nobody ever tells you why this is happening. You are left with the impression that this is one of those savage, backward areas of the world in which there are swirling currents of ethnicities and primitive communal conflicts, and that's why people like that do those kind of things. But that's not correct at all. this did not just happen. There's a reason why it happened. Now, at the CIA, I love CIA language, CIA talk. In spook talk, they have a phrase when an operation goes bad and they want to investigate and see what happened. They call it walking back the cat. That means figuring out what happened before, and then before that, and before that, in order to figure out what went wrong. When we walk back the cat on this unfolding Mali tragedy, we find the feline trail leading us in a very interesting direction. Here's what happened. Here's what should be at the bottom, or maybe at the top, of every one of these news stories about the latest atrocity in Mali. It turns out that the roots of this tragedy are to be seen in the American intervention in Libya. Here's what happened. You all know about the American intervention in Libya and what happened there. But what you may not know is that a large core of the shock troops in Gaddafi's army was made up of an ethnic group, the Tuaregs, who are nomadic people in North Africa. They've never had a homeland of their own. Periodically, there have been uprisings or efforts by the Tuaregs to try to build themselves a homeland. They come from a region that's in northern Mali and surrounding areas. After the overthrow of Gaddafi, the Tuaregs in Gaddafi's army fled. They all left en masse in trucks and jeeps, and they took with them the heaviest, best, and most advanced weapons in Gaddafi's arsenal. They decided, now's our time to go back to northern Mali and establish the homeland about which we've always dreamed. So they came back, and with the power of their arsenal, easily were able to overwhelm the lightly armed Mali army. Into this mix, however, came a third force, Al-Qaeda, looking for North African upheaval as a way to promote and root itself in that region, saw this upheaval and immediately began calling for jihadists from all over the world to come and join AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, go into northern Mali and fight to destroy not just the Mali army, but also the Tuaregs. And sure enough, they succeeded in doing that. So it's out of this upheaval that this terribly violent and repressive force has taken over northern Mali in a way that is not only most tragic for the people who live there, but distressing to the United States in a strategic way. Here is an example of an unimagined consequence. I'd like to think that when people in the White House were discussing whether or not to intervene in Libya, the question of the Tuaregs in Gaddafi's army would have come up. And somebody would have said, well, those people are definitely going to flee, and what would that mean? Now, maybe they would have said, well, that's a risk we're going to have to take. I like to think that. I have a fear, however, that maybe nobody in the room had ever even heard the word Tuareg. This is why I feel it's so important not only to weigh the negative consequences of interventions that you can foresee, but to have the humility to understand that there will always be consequences that nobody can foresee. Now, I want to take this lesson and apply it to other situations in the Middle East. The one that's been in the news frequently in recent weeks is the terrible tragedy in Syria. I do think that the results of the Libya intervention, not so much the Tuareg episode, which I don't think many people have focused on, but the upheaval that has followed the overthrow of Gaddafi, has made it less likely that the United States will intervene militarily in Syria. I consider this good. This is a positive outcome. The opposition in Syria is made up of many groups. Al-Qaeda is one of the strongest. There is nothing to suggest, despite the fantasies of many people in Washington, that when a dictator is overthrown, a better regime will replace him. We like to believe this, but history doesn't offer much evidence for this. There's no reason to expect that the new regime that follows a dictatorship will follow public opinion, or that it will even want to. that it will even care about public opinion. Nor is there any guarantee that if the regime does accurately reflect public opinion, that public opinion would be good for us. It may be very bad for us. I see the danger in Syria that I also see to a certain degree in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is that increasing stories about how awful things have become will tug at the American heartstrings and bring to the fore emotions that will lead us to want to intervene in Syria, and to want to go back to Afghanistan after we've left and save people from what will certainly be a most unpleasant situation there after we withdraw. I hope this doesn't happen, because emotion is always the enemy of wise statecraft. Interests is a much better guide. Let's sit down and think what's really in America's interest over the long run. Americans are a little bit uncomfortable with this, and I find this unusual. Other nations are not like this. For example, I used to live in Turkey. Every spring, the Turkish Air Force would go and bomb Kurdish rebel hideouts in Iraq. And when asked by the outside world and by their own people, why are you violating international law by bombing another country? The answer from the Turkish leaders was always, it's in Turkey's interest. We have to do this. No one stands up for Turkey in the world except for Turkey. We have to defend our own interests. Like Sandra, I've developed a great interest in Rwanda. When you start to learn about the French involvement in Rwanda, you see how awful it was, how horrific was their influence. And that's true in other places in Africa too. When the French leaders traditionally have been confronted about this, they have the same answer. Why did you do that? C'est pour la France. It was for France. It's in France's interest. France does what's good for France. French people accept this, like Turkish people accept Turkish leaders saying, we do what's good for us. But Americans don't like to hear that. We have a kind of a childlike innocence that makes it difficult for us to believe that we would ever act in the world for something so crass as our own interest. We want it to be clothed in something more attractive. Now, I see an even more dangerous and imminent problem if we're going eastward from Mali to Libya to Syria, we can move into Iran, where I do see a serious crisis growing and a serious potential for American intervention in the form of bombing. I think this would be a great mistake. I've spent a fair amount of time in Iran, and one of the things that I find most remarkable there, and this obviously has not gotten through to the American public, is that the Iranian population, I'm going to go out on a limb and say this now, is the most pro-American population of any country in the world. It's absolutely amazing to sit in a room in Iran or in a restaurant or in a public place and mention that you're American. You're suddenly surrounded by people who are practically swooning in joy. I had one woman come up to me on a street corner, and when she realized I was American, said, "We know they hate us over there, but we love you so much." You don't even hear that in Canada. It's difficult for us to try to make a deal with Iran under the present circumstances, but at the very least, we should not be doing anything in Iran that will make it more difficult for us to restore friendly ties when that becomes possible. I am one of those who doesn't like the sanctions regime in Iran for two reasons. I don't like who it hurts, and I don't like who it helps. This is my third round with sanctions. I watched the sanctions in Yugoslavia. I watched the sanctions in Iraq. Now I'm seeing them again in Iran, and I see a clear pattern. One is, who do they hurt? They really hurt the middle class. In fact, in Iran, they are now devastating the middle class. The people in the power elite are always able to get what they want. I believe that when you want to stabilize a country, when you want to democratize a country, the one strategy that works is build up the middle class. strong middle class begins to develop economic rights, then it wants political rights. It always looks for a political vehicle to influence government. So rather than try to weaken the middle class or take steps that do that, we should be trying everything we can to try to strengthen the middle class in countries that we hope will evolve toward democracy. Second reason I don't like sanctions is who they help. Whenever there are sanctions in a country, don't believe, as maybe you can from far away, that all the good stuff they want doesn't get into the country. The opposite is true. You go into the marketplace and you can buy anything. If you're in Iran now under the tightest sanctions ever, as we keep reading, you can buy the iPhone 5 in any stall in the bazaar. Everything is available. Why? Because there are sanctions busters. Every time there's sanction busters. Who are the sanction busters? Well, they're not nice, gentle people. They're criminals. You have to be, because it's a crime. And these are criminals that are usually connected to the regime. In Serbia, it was the death squads. The people that were out massacring Muslim families and burning down mosques were making their money by busting the sanctions. They were cooperating with Greece and Greek Cyprus to bring into Serbia everything anybody wanted if you had money to pay for it. That's what fueled much of the death squad activity in Serbia. I'm seeing something similar in Iran. The group that is the sanctions busters in Iran is the Revolutionary Guard. The Revolutionary Guard is the most brutally oppressive organ in Iran. They're the ones that crack down on the election, as we saw so graphically on our television screens during that horrible few weeks. The Revolutionary Guard is the enemy of everything the United States would like to see Iran become, and the enemy, I believe, of most of what most Iranians want. Every day, the ships from the Revolutionary Guard are going to Dubai, and they're bringing back every piece of electronics and everything anybody would ever want in Iran. So while the middle class collapses, the most thuggish and repressive organs thrive. This is a result of our sanctions. I would like to see the United States make more of an effort to open a broader dialogue with Iran. I don't think it's going to work to have negotiations with Iran only on the nuclear issue, because that's the issue we care about. Just as a general matter of diplomacy, it's not productive to start to ask your adversary to sit down and negotiate only the issue you care about. You want to open up the negotiations to issues that the other side cares about. So I'd like to see these negotiations be a little bit more global. I also think we have to realize you have to play the long game with Iran. You're not going to expect results right away or quickly. But I have to tell you this. I get invited to those luncheons with President Ahmadinejad every time he comes to New York in September. And I went to one just a couple of weeks ago. He's never very forthcoming. He wasn't this time either. There was one professor there who asked, for a very small thing, would it be possible for him to stop referring to Israel as the Zionist entity and start calling it Israel? No, that didn't work. We even had a former hostage there who asked, would it be possible for you to suspend the annual marches when you celebrate the takeover of the American embassy? That didn't get very far either. Ahmadinejad did suggest at several points that a lot of things in Iran are beyond his power, which I believe is true, since he and the supreme leader who holds ultimate power are on quite different pages now. Nonetheless, that meeting is always interesting to me because of the other people who show up. You have in that room the 30 or 40 most knowledgeable Iran watchers in America. So I always thought that even if Ahmadinejad didn't come, it would be a great meeting. Sure enough, during the lunch after Ahmadinejad spoke, I sat next to one of the most distinguished American retired diplomats, Frank Wisner, great Middle East expert. And during the course of our conversation, I said this to him, you know, Ambassador, you are such an articulate promoter of the idea of negotiation with Iran. And there are other diplomats like you, retired people from the very top level of American diplomacy, like Bill Lewers, who was our former ambassador in Venezuela and has been very active in United Nations matters. Tom Pickering, who was George W. Bush's ambassador to the United Nations. These people are so strongly urging a different approach to Iran. So I said to Ambassador Wisner, I wish that somebody would send you guys to Tehran and just tell you, just go see what you can get. Just go see what's out there. Go see what's available. And he turned to me and said, we are dying to go. I don't believe we've truly explored all our options with Iran. I hope that part of that reason is that we're in an election campaign and that anybody suggesting dialogue with Iran is finished. You can be sure tonight that the candidates will be trying to outdo each other as to how much they're going to oppress Iran, how harsh they're going to be on Iran, just like it used to be about how hard you're going to be on the communists in the 1950s. You won't see either candidate saying, maybe we need a change of approach with Iran. Maybe we should try to recognize some of Iran's needs and see what kind of a compromise we can reach. The reason you won't hear that is because that's the essence, I think, of the reason why we haven't made this approach. When you negotiate with a country in the hope of achieving a serious diplomatic settlement, you have to be ready to compromise. You have to give the other person something substantial in order to get something substantial. I don't believe the United States is psychologically at this point yet. We're not ready to say, Iran has legitimate security interests. Iran's interests need to be taken into account. Any kind of a deal is going to require that. It's going to require that Iran be given a position in the Middle East more than we would like to see it have. Therefore, we are reluctant about the whole idea of negotiations. I do feel that there is much potential there. I hope that the United States will restrain itself, as even some voices in Israel are now urging, and realize that attacking too soon can create repercussions that we will have to live with for years or decades or generations. Each world crisis is different. There's no automatic formula for when to intervene and when not to intervene. What's most important, however, is that we approach these situations with humility. Sometimes I think the United States has become so confident in itself that we believe we can actually shape the course of history, or that historical forces don't count, they don't affect us. In the United States, as Americans, we grow up with this, what's sometimes called a can-do mentality. It's a wonderful thing. It teaches us that if you want something badly enough and you work hard enough, you're going to get it. This is what helped build our country. Without it, we wouldn't be where we are. On the other hand, there's a negative side to the can-do mentality. It is true that if you work hard and focus, you can overcome many obstacles that are posed by technology or by nature or by other people. But some of the obstacles we face in the world are the result of culture. These are cultures that are very deep-seated, cultures that were already deep-seated when the United States hadn't even come into existence yet. It's important for us to realize that there isn't one successful and positive way to govern a country. It's also important for us to realize that when dictatorships are removed, it's foolish to expect that this will result in the natural pro-American sentiment of the people being expressed. We sometimes have difficulty appreciating that anti-Americanism in the world doesn't come from the two sources we like to imagine. First of all, I think we figure some people that are anti-American, they're just misinformed, or they're under brutal leaderships and not able to understand how good we are, so they just need to be shown the reality of the United States. And the other reason is, that people wouldn't like us, is they're bad people. Naturally, people who are evil are not going to like good people like us. I'm feeling the same way about myself. I'm actually such a nice guy. I really am. And if you don't like me, the only two possible reasons could be that either you don't know me, you don't know what a nice guy I am, or you're a jerk and you wouldn't like a nice person like me. The idea that you know everything about me and you're smart and you just don't like me because you know who I am. That's not possible. I think this is America's attitude, that there aren't really good reasons for people to be critical of us. Sometimes I think we underestimate the anger that is out there. I was very impressed with the new president of Egypt making this statement. The huge amount, the Niagara of dollars that the United States has poured into the Middle East since the end of the Second World War has earned you the hatred of hundreds of millions of people in this region. That's not what we thought we were buying. But I will just conclude with this other note. As I travel around the world, one thing that always impresses me is that despite all of America's misdeeds in the world, there's a tremendous reservoir of admiration for the United States out there. People admire what we've been able to accomplish, and they realize this doesn't come automatically. This is something special. We have a lot that people in the world want. This country has a great story to tell. I feel that we're not telling it enough, that we have faded away from the idea that we want to tell our stories by inviting people into our libraries and showing them our movies and showing them aspects of our culture and our life that are positive. In too many places in the world, the only face of American power is a soldier with a bulletproof vest on and a gun who kicks down your door. That's not the image of the United States that we should be projecting. The militarization of our foreign policy has led us to begin abandoning the greatest weapon we have, which is our own story. This is the city on the hill story that is very appealing to many in the world. When John Winthrop first used that phrase, "We shall be as a city upon a hill, and the eyes of all people are upon us," what he meant, as he wrote later on, was that we should create the best society we can, and maybe other countries will notice it, and they'll want to copy some aspects of what we have. Somewhere along the line, that got changed. And the idea was that we've created such an ideal society that we want to go out and share it with everybody else. And we particularly need to share it with those people who are so ignorant that they don't even realize how much they need to learn from us. We now have more people in military bands than we have diplomats in the State Department. Somehow, where along the line our policies got skewed. We have 11 carrier groups around the world, each composed of an aircraft carrier and a large group of other warships. No other country in the world has more than one. And the personnel that it takes to maintain one carrier group is roughly equal to the personnel of diplomats in the entire State Department. I'd like to see a rebalancing of that. I'd like to see a sense that while the soldiers are our heroes, our diplomats are also our heroes. We have to realize that we have a great face to give to the world. Let's show that face. Thank you. Thank you. Well, we've got some time to chat, so I'm ready for the firing line. Yes, sir.
You seem to not want to venture what happens, what changes if Romney gets elected.
Uh-huh. So question was, what if Romney gets elected? Frankly, when Barack Obama was elected president, I don't think he had ever learned or cared much about foreign affairs. He'd never had a job that required him to do that, except for 2 years in the Senate when he didn't concentrate on foreign affairs. I think you could say the same about Romney now. I don't think Romney's particularly interested in world affairs, nor is he particularly knowledgeable about it. Now, Obama's had 4 years to learn, so he's probably a little further ahead. But neither of them started out or decided to run for president for issues related to the world. Romney's foreign policy team is quite a mix. There are some people in there that I think would be a fine Secretary of State. There are some people in there who I think would be terrible as Secretary of State. I don't know the internal dynamics. Maybe that group has been put together in order to please each segment of the Republican Party, and which group Romney personally identifies with is something I can't guess. Maybe we'll learn a little bit tonight. But I tell you, I'm going to go out on a limb and say this. Here's something I fear. And it's hard to it's hard to find more than just gut reasons to believe this, although there have been some statements that suggest it. I fear that a Romney presidency will make it more likely that the United States will go to war with Iran. I was terrified when I heard Romney say, when asked what he would do with Iran, he would say, when it comes to a crisis, I'm going to call up my friend Benjamin Netanyahu and ask him what he thinks we should do. This is subcontracting American foreign policy, which is something I and George Washington don't like. Here's the analogy I would draw. Suppose we had an Italian-American president, and together with his 3 or 4 richest Italian-American supporters, went to the Vatican and said to the Pope, what should I be doing in foreign policy? Americans would never tolerate this. So I worry about this. I think even in Israel, there's much debate about the Netanyahu approach to Iran. In fact, as any of you know who have been in Israel, the space to debate Israel, what Israel is and what Israel does, is much wider in Israel than it is in the United States. Members of the Knesset get up and say things every day that would make any American congressman lose his seat immediately. Sometimes I envy the freedom of the journalists over there, because what I read in Haaretz is more radical than I ever read in terms of critiques of Israel than what I read in the United States. So I fear this, and the one other thing I would say about Romney is, this is something that he has said, he wants to build up the American military up to a level, he specifically cited 4% of GDP. This is something that the American military has never asked for. We're looking for ways to cut, and independent analysts have concluded that this will add $2 trillion to our deficit in the next 10 years. When I hear the statement, I'm going to be sure that America has an army second to none, I think to myself, what a vacuous platitude. The fact is, we have an army second to none. We are going to have an army second to none for the lifetime of everyone in this room and the lifetime of all the children of everyone in this room. It doesn't matter who gets elected president. But what about, we're going to have a diplomatic corps second to none. We're going to have an effort to reach out to the world and to the world's people that's second to none. Somehow at election campaign time, the chest thumping becomes a little bit too much to bear. I hope that the pendulum swings back after the election. We calm down a little, and the rhetoric that in which each candidate has to be tougher than the other one settles back into something that's a little more realistic.
There was a reason I asked that.
I'm so surprised. I had no idea.
I think not only, people could say he's exploiting this Libyan situation, but he's also exploiting the need of Americans to have pat answers. And that's a real problem.
Yeah, I agree with you that that's what he's doing. But what I would ask you this is, how does this differentiate himself from most other politicians? I mean, you don't say things that you know are going to lose you votes. You can do that after the election. Yeah, pat answers, it's true. Platitudes are part of political campaigns. I deplore this, as you do, and I deplore that Romney's doing it. I only wish it was only Romney, and I could point to him and say, oh, all other politicians are actually really fully honest with the American people. When I'm at that point, then I'll really know who I can vote for and who to vote against. Now I'm having a little more trouble. Yes, sir.
I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm sorry you were too modest to mention your magnificent book, Overthrow. And I know there are a lot of demands on the time of President Obama and Governor Romney, but it's hard for me to imagine a book from which they might benefit more than reading this book. And I would recommend it in the strongest possible terms to the audience here as well. If whoever is elected, and people who know me in this room will know, I hope it isn't Governor Romney, but if whoever is elected were to appoint you to take charge of the whole Syria operation and give you a free hand going forward and would defer to your advice, how do you think you would proceed with that mission?
Well, my first reaction upon receiving a call from Washington saying that they wanted my advice would be to say, you must have the wrong number. I'm so far off the reservation. It really is remarkable to me. Every time I go to Washington, which is as rarely as possible, I'm impressed again with how powerful is the force that pulls people into the consensus, and how narrow is the spectrum of acceptable opinions, and how fierce and swift is the punishment when you step outside that very narrow spectrum. There's this syndrome in Washington that if you make the wrong few comments, you'll never get invited to this lunch again, and you won't be in this think tank, and you'll be considered crazy, and you're off the chattering class list. Fortunately, that doesn't apply to the rest of us who are not waiting for those phone calls. But I'll tell you, the desire, the hope, however faint, that you might someday be asked to become co-deputy vice assistant of something in Washington is paralyzing to the creative minds of many people who think about world affairs. So what would I do about Syria? Easy question. First of all, let me tell you a little story that happened to me when I was I was in Turkey a few months ago, and I was on the border with Syria. And I went to the Turkish border guards, and I said, so what's the refugee situation here? They said, we don't have any refugees. I said, but that can't be true, because I read my newspaper, and it says the refugees are flooding over. And they said, well, that may be happening in another part of the border. It's a long border, but here, we haven't had any refugees, and we'll tell you why. He said, there's a special reason. The Syrians who live in this part of Syria, they are ethnic Turkomen. And the Turkomen know that when the Assad regime falls, it's finished for all minorities in Syria. No Jews will be able to live there, no Turkomen, it'll be difficult for the Kurds, there will be no Christians, there'll be no Alawites, it will be just Muslim Brotherhood. So they don't want to flee, they want to help defend the regime, because minority life is finished in Syria after Assad falls. That's a line I hadn't really heard too much in the American press. Very interesting. It shows you, it really does help to go places to learn about things. So my takeaway is this. I'm absolutely shocked and horrified that the Syria situation has gotten to the point that it has. It's beyond words. It's so awful. There's no reason for this to have happened. I now feel that there's no way that Assad can regain the confidence of Syrians and reunite them. Nonetheless, I'm terrified about what comes after Assad. Therefore, I would try to design an outcome in which some form of this regime remains intact, but without Assad. And this is not so unusual in countries where there have been these kinds of dictatorships. You remember that when Mubarak was overthrown, it was the army command that overthrew him. Now, don't think that it was the people in Tahrir Square. Mubarak did not get up and look out the window and say, oh, gee, a lot of people out here don't seem to like me. I guess I'll retire. That's not the way it works. The generals came to him and said, we got to throw you under the bus, because otherwise we're all going down. That's the mentality that I would like to instill in the minds of Syrians around Assad. That with a change in policy, you might be able to maintain a regime that, although not the kind we would like, might be able to return a certain stability to Syria. So that would be my goal. Find some form of this regime incorporating other factions that it has kept out of the regime, because it's a regime that represents an ethnic group that's only 12% of the population. Get rid of Assad, because lamentably, I think he's just beyond the pale now. And see if we can't encourage the emergence in Syria of some kind of an alternative. It's always dangerous to try to impose these alternatives from abroad. This is what we try to do in Libya. And what happens is, in periods before revolutions, when revolutions are domestic, different revolutionary groups fight, and during the fighting, it becomes clear which groups are stronger and which are weaker. By the time they finally overthrow the regime, it's pretty clear which are the dominant groups, and those become the government. When the regime is overthrown from outside, this process hasn't happened yet. There's 25 groups in Libya. They haven't had a chance to show which one is stronger. That's what the fighting is now. And so the fighting happens after the revolution. I'd like to see us let the Syrians try to come up with an option and throw our negotiating strength, particularly with our friends the Turks, who I think are our best partners in this effort, towards an alternative that would bring about a change in the top leadership and a reinvigorated and broadened version of this regime. That's a bad option, but in Syria, I don't see real good ones. Yes, sir.
The structure of your remarks suggests that you're not a fan of multilateralism. Although your last remark about the Turks suggests maybe you are. Are you a fan of multilateralism? And when do you think what do you think its pros and cons are?
I actually am a fan of multilateralism. I think there are regions in the world where, surprise, surprise, we don't really know everything. There are parts of the world where our partners are better informed than we are, and the Middle East is a great example. Turkey's been in the Middle East all its life. We just got there 50 years ago. And I think the Turks are good partners for us because their long-term strategic goals are similar to ours, unlike, for example, Saudi Arabia, whose long-term strategic goals are really at odds with ours. And Turkish society resembles ours in many ways, unlike, for example, Saudi society, which doesn't resemble ours at all. That's what makes Turkey a good ally. So I would like to see us work more closely with allies around the world. And actually, I'm not such a big fan of Henry Kissinger, but I want to suggest a kind of a version of his geostrategic concept. Kissinger had this idea that the United States should have one big country in every part of the world that would be the base from which we would project our power and influence all over that region. So we had Mobutu in the Congo. He was our Africa guy. We had Suharto in Indonesia. That was that guy. We had the Shah in Iran. I'd like to do the same kind of thing, but not use that country as a springboard for the projection of military power. Use it as the springboard for projection of softer power. Let's pick countries in different parts of the world where we see that we share long-term strategic goals and where societies are somewhat similar to ours. And let's use those as force multipliers for the kind of force that I think can really be effective in bringing the world toward peace. Yes?
How about North Korea?
Yeah.
Can you foresee a scenario where American troops would actually leave South Korea anywhere near in the future?
I see that as difficult unless it were in the framework of much of a broader agreement. And that agreement would have to be based on the old Reagan principle of trust but verify. The North Korean regime has not given us much reason to be confident in its promises. I would love to see the demilitarization of the Korean Peninsula. I actually think many people in South Korea would like that too. I'll tell you a little story. When I was in Germany, it was a period when East Germany was being assimilated into West Germany. And one day I found out that a delegation from South Korea had come to Germany to observe this process, thinking that we might have to go through the same process. So the rich part of the country will have to reabsorb the poor part that has now collapsed. And I met a couple of people in this delegation, and they said we were completely shocked, and we now don't want unification anymore. We say it's too much. We couldn't handle it. The countries have grown apart too far. The difficulties are too great. The expense is too high. And I'll tell you one other little observation about Korea. I teach at Boston University a number of foreign policy-related courses, and at one point we were speculating what bloc or what country could emerge seriously to challenge American global power. And I suggested if there could ever be a bloc of China, Japan, and United Korea, they would rule the world. So my Korean student raised her hand and said, "You're absolutely right, but that can never happen. History does not make it possible." So I would see the withdrawal of American troops from South Korea as a desirable goal, but not realistic unless there can be enough of a change in North Korea so that they could sign agreements in which we'd have confidence, and that requires a very big change. Sandra.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to ask you about this, but religious fundamentalism and its role in most every place in the world.
So the question was about religious fundamentalism and its role. Well, I think you've put your finger on the worst force in the world today. I think it's the most dangerous and the most pernicious force, religious fundamentalism. And you'll see this in all religions, and you see it in too many parts of the world. Don't forget, Christianity kept Europe in the Dark Ages for 1,000 years. We're seeing versions of that now. And what is so distressing about this is the role that the United States played in fomenting all of this. As we have become close partners with Saudi Arabia, we have tacitly accepted Saudi Arabia's deal with its own religious establishment. That is the most radical religious establishment certainly in the Muslim world, probably in the whole world. And this extreme Salafist form of Islam requires absolute purity in trying to build the ideal world of the 7th century. So the deal that the Saudi regime has made with the Salafist clerics is quite a simple one. We know that our lifestyle is very un-Islamic. You cannot walk into a casino in Marseille without seeing some Saudi prince drunk with 6 women around him spending millions of dollars. That's not what Muhammad had in mind in the 7th century. You won't talk about that. Don't mention any of our misdeeds. And don't mention that we happen to be military partners with the country that you consider to be the great Satan. Don't point that out to anyone. And don't foment religious extremism and tell people in this country that they have a right to rebel against infidel regimes. That's what you have to do. In exchange, we will give you billions of dollars with which you can go out and promote all these ideas everywhere else in the world. That is why Salafist Islam got to Afghanistan and Pakistan. There was no such thing as a suicide bomber. There was no radical Islam in Afghanistan ever. It's a very light, Sufi-oriented version of Islam. But it was implanted there by money from Saudi Arabia, which was spent abroad because the Saudis didn't want this ideology to be fomented inside Saudi Arabia. And that's why a number of the jihadists all over the world are from Saudi Arabia, and why most of the 9/11 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. These are people who were told by Salafist clerics, go attack all evil regimes, but not ours. Keep ours in power because they're the ones that are giving us money. Hypocrisy is a central foundation of the Saudi regime. But there's a little bit of hypocrisy on our part as well. That money, that's our money. And I'm even going to take a little bit of the blame for this myself. I don't like to, like all of us, point out my failures, but here's one that still bothers me. This might have been, journalists always think about the stories they missed. And it's like fishermen, I guess, but it's on a more profound scale. I covered Central Asia for the New York Times, and this would have been in the late 1990s. These countries were just emerging from the Soviet Union. And there I was traipsing around Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, Pakistan, and I was noticing everywhere I was going, my God, here's a little village, and they got this spectacular mosque, and free food for all the boys that want to come there, and education, everything. Amazing. It's worth more than the whole rest of the village put together. I go to the next place and see the same thing. And I would ask them, what's happening? And they'd say, oh, the wonderful Saudis have come, and they have offered to build us a free mosque. I saw this over and over. I never put it together. That was such a huge story. That was the beginning of all of this that we're seeing now. They spread those seeds, and I watched the seeds begin to germinate, and I didn't pick up on it. I'm picking up on it now, and unfortunately I feel that this is a force that the United States will have to contend with more difficulty than any other force in the world today. All right, we have time for one more. Go ahead.
What sort of strategies might you suggest if they ever did call you up to cope with this force?
I feel that most people in the world retreat into absolutism out of frustration. If there are other options available, if the alternative of a more open society is available, many, not all, of these people can be attracted. This is one reason that I admire what Turkey is doing. Turkey's greatest influence on the world is not its foreign policy, it's just sitting there. All the people from Arab countries are coming into Turkey. They're walking around, then they go home, and they start thinking, we could do this. If we would abandon some of our policies, maybe we could live like the Turks. So I think the building up of states that offer an alternative to radical Islam is very important. This naturally requires support for Muslim countries. Turkey, I think, is a great one because it's an example of the kind of societies we would like to see in most Muslim countries. And I'll just add this. Behind much of the conflict in the Middle East that you're seeing now lies a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia for hegemony. And the United States, of course, very much involved on the Saudi side. Both of these countries would like to be the dominant power in that part of the world. But something very important has changed in history, in the world, since the days of the Cold War. It used to be that countries would choose to be under the wing of one hegemon or another hegemon simply by the whim of the dictator. I mean, I remember reading, so Nasser decides he's pro-American. We're going to take American help. They're going to build the Aswan Dam. One day we decide, no, we don't like you. We're not going to help you. Nasser wakes up. He says, okay, I've changed my mind. I sign a paper. We're pro-Soviet now. Egypt has moved from one camp to the other by the one signature of one guy after one whim. You can't do that anymore. Enough change has happened in the Middle East so that countries will move under the wing of larger protective powers only if the people in that country want to do that. This is something new. Now, what this means in the Middle East is something very important. Most people in the Middle East don't want to live like the people in Iran. And they don't want to live like the people in Saudi Arabia. They're not attracted to either of these potential hegemons. They really want to live like people in Turkey. And I think this is one reason why Turkey can be a force multiplier for us. What I think we need to do is build up poles of attraction that will show societies that there is another option. This is one reason why I was so disappointed at the way Europe slammed the door in Turkey's face. I feel that if Europe had been more accommodating to Turkey, other countries around the Middle East and other Muslim countries would say, you know, it shows you. If you adopt an open economy and a free political system, all the doors of the world are open to you. Instead, they sent the opposite message, which is, if you're a Muslim country, it doesn't matter how hard you try, the West will never take you. But whatever the strategy, I do feel this should be a fundamental line of American foreign policy, if I can use that word. I believe we ought to be having a concerted global strategy for how to weaken the attraction of religious fundamentalism. It is the most dangerous force in the world today. And although in some ways I welcome the geopolitical changes in the world, because they mean that the United States will be able to do less bad, less damage in the world, they also mean that the United States is going to be able to do less good in the world. I want to try to rebalance our foreign policy in the future so that changes in the world would weaken our interest in doing things that in the long run hurt us and strengthen our interest in doing things that will help us in the long run. The only problem with this is that you lose interest. You lose the interest of people in Washington with that phrase, in the long run. People are interested in quick results. And these are the fundamental problems we're dealing with in the world don't lend themselves to quick results. This is also something you won't hear tonight in the debate, because people are interested in quick results. And I think this is a little bit of a weakness of Americans, too. We're very impatient. And we sometimes feel we've transcended history, that history doesn't apply to us anymore. We need to reshape our approach to the world that is still, I think, afflicted by Cold War mentalities, that there's always them against us, and also afflicted by a couple of syndromes that go even further back. Those are two lessons that we learned from World War II, and I will close with this one. The first lesson we learned from World War II was, you can say it in one word, Pearl Harbor. What it means is, you might think you're at peace, but there's always someone out there who could be bombing you at any moment. So you better be active, and you better be out there, and you better be proactive and be sure that, as Dick Cheney said, you remember the 5% rule? If there's a 5% chance that a country might attack you, you should go and attack them first. That's lesson one. The only lesson that I hate more than that one is lesson 2, which can also be summarized in one word: Munich. Munich means never negotiate. Do not compromise. All you have to, because compromise and negotiation is always a form of defeat. This is the wrong lesson. The lesson of Munich 1933 is that Neville Chamberlain made a mistake appeasing Hitler that day. It doesn't mean that appeasement is bad. Actually, appeasement is just another word for diplomacy. I give you one example: the Berlin airlift. When Stalin closed off the access routes to Berlin, he was explicitly violating not only his personal commitments, but international treaties that he had signed. There's no question that the cutting off of Berlin was 100% illegal by every international law and treaty. And the United States had every legal reason to pull a tank up to that first roadblock and blow it up. But we didn't do that. We appeased the Russians because we were afraid of the consequences. We found another way around. We finessed it. And ultimately, we were able to get out of that crisis without war. We were just talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. The same thing happened. We learned a lesson from the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and it was, be very tough, don't blink, don't compromise, don't negotiate, and the other guy will back down. It was only 25 years later that it was revealed that wasn't what we did. We did the opposite. We made a deal. We quietly offered the Soviets something. We gave Khrushchev something he could sell to his own people. So I like learning lessons from history, but let's learn the real lessons, not the fake ones. On that note, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for coming. Another highlight of the Schemmel program I didn't mention is next Tuesday, when we're going to have Scranton's own great playwright, Stephen Karam, in conversation with one of New York's great treasures, Paul Holden Robber, who is the head of public programs at the New York Public Library, and he's turned that into a really wonderful institution. That is the public programs. It was always a great institution. But anyway, don't miss that either. That's Tuesday night. For now, I just will say that we can't wait till you come back, Stephen.
I'll be here.